A grown man had his hand wrapped around a young woman's throat, lifting her off the ground, while 40 people sat there and did absolutely nothing. Plates still warm, coffee still steaming, not one person moved, except a quiet guy in the corner booth. Scarred hands, tired eyes, a big German shepherd sleeping at his feet. He set down his fork. He said 4 words, and then the dog moved. And 7 seconds later, 3 men were on the floor, and nothing in Greyport would ever be the same again. If you're new here, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. Drop your city or country in the comments right now. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. And trust me, you do not want to miss what comes next. The rain had been falling on Greyport for 6 straight days. Not dramatic rain, not cinematic rain with lightning and thunder and meaningful pauses. Just that particular breed of Pacific Northwest misery. Gray, cold, relentless. The kind that soaks through your jacket in the first 30 seconds and makes you question every decision that led you to this particular stretch of coastline. The kind of rain that feels personal. Evan Mercer had driven into town 4 days ago with a duffel bag, a military-grade first aid kit he no longer needed for missions, and Shadow, a 9-year-old German shepherd who still moved like he was on patrol even when he was technically retired. Evan had rented the cheapest motel room available, the one on the end of the ground floor where the heating unit rattled all night and the window overlooked a dumpster. He paid cash. He gave his real name because lying about small things was a habit he'd never developed, even when larger lies were sometimes necessary. He hadn't told anyone why he was in Greyport, partly because nobody asked, partly because the answer was complicated. The official version: Evan Mercer, 34 years old, former Navy SEAL, honorably discharged after sustaining injuries during an operation in a location the military still officially described as undisclosed. His left knee had been rebuilt twice. 3 of his ribs had healed at angles that weren't quite anatomically ideal. He had a compressed disc in his lower back that 2 different military surgeons had described using words like remarkable and survivable, in tones that suggested they were genuinely surprised by both. The unofficial version: Evan had spent 11 years being extraordinarily good at doing things in the dark that kept other people safe in the light. And then one night in a place he couldn't name, something went wrong in a way he couldn't discuss. And suddenly the machine that had consumed his entire adult life looked at him, decided he was no longer operationally viable, and handed him a handshake, a pension, and a pamphlet about veteran services. He'd sat in the parking lot of the discharge office for 40 minutes before he could make himself start the car. Shadow had rested his head on Evan's knee the entire time. That had been 7 weeks ago. Since then, Evan had driven. No destination, no timeline. Just the highway and the dog and the radio set to stations playing music from the 90s because anything newer made him feel like a stranger in his own country. He'd stopped in Greyport because the harbor looked quiet from the highway overpass, and quiet was the one thing he'd decided he needed more than anything else on earth. He'd been wrong about the quiet part. The Alvarez family diner sat on the corner of Harbor Street and Clement Avenue, wedged between a bait shop and a laundromat. The kind of place that survived not because of location or marketing, but because of the food and the family that made it. Hand-painted letters on the window. A chalk menu board that hadn't changed its core offerings in 15 years. The smell of green chili and fresh brewed coffee that hit you from half a block away. Evan found it on his 3rd day in town, following his nose like Shadow followed everything else. He'd claimed booth 9. The back corner, wall on 2 sides, clear sight lines to both the front door and the kitchen entrance, positioned so that his back was never exposed. Old habits. Some things the military burned into you so deep, they just became personality. Shadow lay under the table, his gray muzzle resting on his front paws, watching the room with the patient alertness of an animal that had been trained to notice everything, but had learned that most of what he noticed didn't require immediate action. He was older now. There was white around his eyes that hadn't been there 3 years ago. But his ears still rotated like satellite dishes, and his dark eyes still cataloged every movement in the room with quiet efficiency. Evan had ordered eggs. He was on his 3rd cup of coffee when he first noticed the tension. It wasn't obvious. Most people in the diner didn't seem to register it at all. But Evan had spent years learning to read rooms the way other people read weather, not the obvious signs, but the micro shifts, The way Miguel Alvarez, who had introduced himself the first morning with a handshake and a free coffee refill and the specific warmth of a man genuinely glad you'd walk through his door, was now moving differently, too quickly, too quietly. His shoulders were up near his ears. He kept glancing toward the front window. His daughter Sophia was working the counter. She was maybe 23, 24. Medical textbooks stacked near the register suggested she was studying between shifts. Smart eyes, good instincts. Evan had watched her de-escalate 3 separate minor customer complaints that morning with the kind of calm efficiency that takes years to develop. But right now, she was nervous. She was hiding it well, but not perfectly, and Evan had been paid, literally for years, to notice the imperfect hiding. 3 men came through the front door at 11:47. They weren't there for breakfast. The tallest one wore a rain jacket with the hood still up even indoors. The other 2 positioned themselves without seeming to, one near the door, one drifting casually toward the far end of the counter. It was done smoothly enough that most of the diners barely registered it. But it was a technique, a specific one. Control the exits, anchor the space, let the primary move freely through the center. Evan set down his coffee cup. Under the table, Shadow's head came up off his paws. The tall one's name, Evan would learn later, was Decker. He walked straight to Miguel with the easy arrogance of a man who had never once in his adult life needed to worry about what happened when he pushed someone. "You're late again, Miguel." Not loud, conversational, which somehow made it worse. Miguel wiped his hands on his apron. A nervous gesture, repetitive, the kind of thing you do when your hands need something to do that isn't shaking. "I told your people the tourist season's been slow. I have the partial amount, and I can have the rest by—" "I don't negotiate timelines." Decker cut him off with the patience of someone who genuinely doesn't care about the other person's words. Mr. Salazar made the terms very clear. "Please," Miguel kept his voice low. "I have customers. Let's talk in the back. I can explain." "Explain what?" Decker looked around the room with theatrical boredom. "That you don't have the money? I got that part." Sophia moved from behind the counter. "Sir, whatever arrangement you have with my father, this isn't the place." "Sophia." Miguel said her name quietly. The single syllable carried 10 years of fatherly fear. She stopped, but she didn't back up. Decker looked at her for a moment. Something shifted in his expression that made Evan's jaw tighten. It wasn't attraction, it was calculation. The specific look of a man identifying something that could be used. "You're the daughter," he said. "Miguel talks about you. Medical school, right? Smart girl." "Sir." Sophia's voice was steady. She was terrified, and she wasn't letting it move her. Evan noticed that, filed it away. "If you have a business matter, please." Decker's hand moved faster than most people would have expected from a man his size. He grabbed her throat. Not a grab that leads somewhere, just a grip. Deliberate, controlled. A demonstration. He lifted slowly, and Sophia's sneakers left the floor by 2 inches, her hands coming up instinctively to his wrist, her eyes wide. The diner went silent so completely that Evan could hear the rain on the window. 40 people. Maybe more. And not one of them moved. Not one fork clattered to a plate in righteous anger. Not one chair scraped back. The silence was a living thing, thick and shameful and completely understandable, because fear is rational, and these people had families, and this man was connected to someone named Salazar, and everyone in Grayport apparently knew what that name meant. Evan did not know what it meant yet. He stood up anyway. He didn't hurry. He didn't shout. He came out of booth 9 the way he did most things, quietly, economically, without any wasted motion. He stopped about 8 feet from Decker. "Put her down." Decker turned his head. The look on his face was the specific look of a man who has just been surprised by something he considers completely beneath his notice, like a parking meter talking back. He looked at Evan, the worn jacket, the scarred hands, the calm face. He looked at Shadow, who had emerged from under the table and was standing at Evan's left side, motionless, not growling, just watching with that particular stillness that Shadow only ever displayed when he had already decided what was about to happen and was simply waiting for permission. "Sit back down," Decker said. "Last time," Evan said. "Put her down." Decker glanced at his guy near the door. A small movement, not quite a nod. More of an acknowledgement. The man near the door started to move. Evan said, Shadow, watch him. The German shepherd's entire body language shifted in a single frame. From still to present, a 95-pound animal suddenly occupying the room differently, his attention snapping to the man near the door with an intensity that made that man stop walking mid-stride. Decker turned back to Evan with something that started as contempt and was beginning, very slightly, to recalibrate. "You have no idea who you're talking to," Decker said. "I know exactly what I'm looking at," Evan said. "Guy who grabs women in public thinks that means something. Usually means the opposite." 3 seconds of silence. Then Decker tightened his grip. "Shadow, fast." What happened next took 7 seconds. Evan had counted them, later, replaying it the way he involuntarily replayed most high-stress events. Not from trauma, but from ingrained debrief habits. 7 seconds, start to finish. Shadow crossed the distance to Decker's right arm in under 1 second. The bite was textbook Schutzhund. Not the throat, not the face, nothing that would kill, because Shadow had been trained to subdue, and he had never once in his service life taken more than he was given permission to take. He took Decker's forearm, above the wrist, with the specific mechanical commitment of an animal whose bite force runs north of 230 pounds per square inch. Decker screamed and released Sophia simultaneously. She dropped, caught herself on the counter edge, and immediately moved left, away from the men, toward the kitchen. Good instincts. Evan was already moving. The second enforcer, the one who had been drifting toward the far end of the counter, came at him fast. He was bigger than Evan, and he telegraphed it like most big men did, leading with the shoulder, expecting mass to win the argument. Evan had spent years fighting people who were bigger than him in environments where size was the least important variable. He stepped inside the swing, applied the kind of joint manipulation that requires knowing exactly where a person's elbow is designed not to bend, and put the man on the floor face first in less than 2 seconds. He didn't slam the man's head into the ground. He didn't need to. Control was enough. Control was always enough if you knew what you were doing. The third man, the one near the door, was backing up with his hands raised by the time Evan looked at him. Shadow was still on Decker, exactly as disciplined as he'd ever been on a real operation. Holding, not escalating. "Shadow, aus." Release command. Shadow released the arm, stepped back, and sat. Just sat, like they'd drilled in a training field and not a diner while 40 people watched in absolute stunned silence. Evan looked at the third man. "Call an ambulance," he said, "for your friend. Then stay right there." He turned around, found Sophia. She had her back against the kitchen door frame, her hand at her throat, her eyes very bright, not crying, considering. "Are you okay?" She took a breath. "Yes." Then, "Who are you?" Before Evan could answer, the sirens started outside. Someone in the diner had called 911, either during or immediately after, and blue and red light was already beginning to pulse through the rain-streaked windows. Decker was on the floor holding his forearm, rage and pain running together across his face in equal measures. "You're dead," he said. Not dramatic, factual, the specific tone of a man reading from a memo. "You understand that? You and that animal, you're both dead." Evan crouched down so they were at eye level. "You lifted a 20-something woman off the floor by her throat in a room full of witnesses," he said quietly. "You've got a dog bite that's going to need stitches, a buddy with a dislocated elbow, and police 30 seconds out. Whatever you were planning to do today, it already went sideways." He stood up. "Save the threats for someone who hasn't heard them in worse places than this." He straightened his jacket, went back to booth 9, picked up his coffee cup. It had gone cold. The 2 officers who came through the door first were young. Evan put them both under 28, and they walked into a room that had the specific atmospheric pressure of a space where something significant had just occurred. Everyone was still seated. 3 men were on the floor in various states of consciousness and injury. A German shepherd was sitting calmly next to a booth in the back corner. They handled it reasonably, Evan thought. They separated people efficiently. They called for backup and medical without being told to. The older detective who arrived 12 minutes later, Claire Donovan, according to her badge, mid-40s, the kind of tired that comes from doing the same job in a small city for long enough to know all its darkest corners by name, she was the one who actually looked at the room correctly. She looked at the injured men, She looked at Sophia, still near the kitchen door, her hand finally down from her throat. She looked at Miguel, who had both hands flat on the counter and was staring at nothing in particular. Then she looked at Evan. He was showing her his ID without being asked. Veteran's ID, driver's license, the paper from the VA discharge that he always kept folded in his front pocket because the alternative was explaining things from scratch, every time. She looked at it, looked at him. "You do this?" she asked. "My dog did most of it." She glanced at Shadow, who looked back at her with the serene dignity of an animal who has nothing to apologize for. "Uh-huh," she said. She pulled up a chair, reversed it, sat down across from him. "Tell me what happened." He told her. Exactly what happened, in the order it happened, without editorializing. The way he'd been trained to debrief, some facts first, impressions clearly labeled as impressions. She didn't interrupt. She took notes in a small spiral pad, the cheap kind from a drugstore, and she had the practiced stillness of a person who had learned that silence makes other people fill it, which is useful when you're interviewing people and dangerous when you're the one being interviewed. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "That man," she said, "is Marco Decker. He works for Victor Salazar." "I don't know who that is." She looked at him steadily. "Mr. Mercer, Victor Salazar owns half the businesses on this waterfront. The other half pays him not to." Evan absorbed that. "And the police?" he said. Something moved across her face. Not guilt exactly. Something more layered than that. "It's complicated," she said. Outside, through the rain-washed windows, he watched the ambulance crew load Decker into the back. Decker was still talking, still performing his particular brand of confidence that prison, apparently, hadn't yet taught him to recalibrate. One of the paramedics, a young woman, kept her face professionally neutral while Decker told her, at length, what was going to happen to the man inside the diner. "Is it, though?" Evan said. Donovan didn't answer. She collected her notes, gave him a card, told him not to leave town, phrased professionally, carefully, in a way that was technically a request rather than an order. He noted the distinction. After she left, Miguel came to the booth. He sat down across from Evan without asking, the way people do when they've run out of small talk because the situation has stripped it all away. He was a compact man in his late 50s, gray at the temples, with the specific calloused hands of someone who had built something from nothing and was used to defending it through labor rather than force. He set a fresh coffee in front of Evan without a word. Evan wrapped both hands around it. "How long has this been going on?" Evan asked. Miguel looked at the table. 7 months. "Always Decker?" "Sometimes others. Decker's the one who comes when you miss a payment." "And you've missed payments." Miguel said nothing, which was an answer. "Does anyone else on the street pay?" "Everyone on the street pays." Miguel's voice was quiet and flat and tired in a way that Evan recognized as the voice of a man who has been carrying something too heavy for too long. "Hardware store on the corner, 2 of the Vietnamese restaurants, the Mexican grocery, the Thai family who runs the hotel by the pier." He looked up. "They have children." The rain hammered the windows. Shadow had fallen asleep again under the table, his paw resting against Evan's boot. "Who is Victor Salazar, exactly?" Evan asked. Miguel's eyes did something complicated. "You should leave Grayport, Mr. Mercer." "I didn't ask me what to do. I asked about Salazar." Miguel studied him for a long moment. Whatever he was looking for in Evan's face, apparently he found enough of it. "Victor Salazar," he said slowly, "is the kind of man who has never been inside a courtroom in his life, even though there are 15 people in this city who could put him there." He paused. "Because those 15 people have families." Evan nodded slowly. He looked out at the harbor. The lights of the pier were blurred through the rain, flickering and indistinct, like something seen from a great distance. He thought about the drive north. He thought about the next quiet town on the map, the next cheap motel, the next restless night where his left knee ached and his ribs reminded him that he was no longer the person who could absorb unlimited damage and simply continue. He thought about Sophia's sneakers leaving the floor. He thought about 40 people sitting very still. "Okay," he said. Miguel blinked. "Okay?" Evan drank his coffee. I'm going to need to know his schedule. The next morning, while Evan was doing his first reconnaissance pass of the harbor district, walking Shadow at 0530, unhurried, just a veteran and his dog in the rain, the first black SUV appeared. It drove slowly past the Alvarez diner. Then it turned around and drove slowly past again. Evan didn't change his pace, but Shadow's ears rotated toward the vehicle and stayed there, tracking it with the quiet precision of a radar dish that had already logged the signature and was waiting for the next contact. 3 days later, when Evan found the listening device zip-tied behind the dumpster outside his motel room, he knew Decker had been talking. He also knew something else. Whoever had placed that device wasn't afraid of him. They just wanted to know how much he knew. He left the device exactly where it was, went inside, opened the motel room's tiny closet, where he'd unpacked his duffel with the specific organization of someone who has spent years knowing exactly where everything is in the dark. He began taking inventory. Shadow sat by the door and watched the parking lot. The device was a cheap one. Evan turned it over in his fingers under the motel room's single working lamp. A small magnetic transmitter, the kind you could order online for under $40, with a battery life of maybe 72 hours and a range that wouldn't reach past 2 city blocks. Consumer grade. The kind of thing someone bought when they wanted to monitor a situation without committing real resources to it, which told him something specific. Whoever had placed it didn't think he was worth the expensive equipment yet. He set it on the nightstand, left it running, went to the window and looked at the parking lot for 90 seconds, cataloging the vehicles. A pickup he'd seen there every night, 2 sedans that rotated, a white panel van that was new tonight and parked at an angle that gave it sightlines to both the room entrance and the lot exit. Amateur staging, functional but sloppy. He closed the curtain. Shadow had moved from the door to the foot of the bed, watching Evan with the attentive patience of an animal waiting for a decision to be made. "Yeah," Evan said to him. "I know." He sat on the edge of the bed and pressed the heel of his hand against his left knee. Not because it helped exactly, but because the pressure gave his brain something to focus on besides the specific grinding ache that 3 surgeries had improved without fixing. The military doctors had used words like manageable and functional threshold, which were professional ways of saying, "It'll hurt, but it won't stop you, and we need you to decide whether that's acceptable." He'd said yes then. He wasn't entirely sure he was still answering the same question. He opened his duffel and removed a worn moleskin notebook, the kind he'd carried since his second deployment, filled margin to margin with the specific shorthand he'd developed over years of operational planning. Grid references, timing windows, personnel patterns, a private language that looked like random notation to anyone else. He opened to a clean page, wrote 1 word at the top, Salazar. Then he started building what he knew. Test. By the time the harbor district woke up the next morning, Evan had already been moving through it for 2 hours. The white van was gone. He noted the absence and the time, 0412, earlier than he'd expected, which meant whoever was watching had a schedule to maintain elsewhere. That was useful. Schedules were predictable. Predictability was a vulnerability. He walked Shadow along the waterfront at the pace of a man with nowhere to be, which he technically was. He bought coffee from a cart operated by a Vietnamese man named Tuan, who was already open at 6 a.m., and who looked at Shadow with the kind of immediate, uncomplicated affection that dogs sometimes inspire in people who are carrying a lot and find animals easier than humans. "Good dog," Tuan said, leaning over the cart to offer the back of his hand. Shadow sniffed it, approved, allowed the ear scratch. "He's a good one," Evan said. "How long have you had this spot?" Tuan straightened, did a quick read of Evan, the kind of look a person develops when they've learned to sort strangers quickly. 12 years. "You know the Alvarez family, the diner on Clement." Something closed in Tuan's expression. Not hostility, more like a door being shut on a draft. "Everybody knows Miguel," he said carefully. "I was there yesterday, when Decker came." A pause. Tuan busied himself with the coffee machine in a way that wasn't entirely about the coffee. "I heard about that," he said. "You pay?" Evan asked. Directly. He'd found that directness, while sometimes socially uncomfortable, saved a remarkable amount of time. Tuan didn't answer for a long moment. Then, "What are you, police?" "No." "Military?" "Used to be." Tuan looked at him again, longer this time. Then he looked at Shadow, who was sitting perfectly still at Evan's left side, ears forward, alert without being anxious. "I pay," Tuan said quietly. "My cousin pays. My cousin's neighbor pays." He handed Evan the coffee. "Everybody on this block pays. To Salazar's people. To whoever shows up with the envelope." Tuan's voice had gone flat, not emotionless, but controlled the way a person gets controlled when the alternative is something they can't afford. "I don't know Salazar. I know the envelope." Evan paid for the coffee, left a tip that was probably too large, and kept walking. He spent the next 3 hours doing what he'd spent 11 years learning to do: pattern analysis on foot. He walked the same 6-block radius 4 times at different paces, each time cataloging something different. First pass, vehicle movement and parking patterns. Second pass, foot traffic, timing, who went where and when. Third pass, the businesses themselves. Which ones had new security cameras? Which ones had boarded sections? Which ones had the specific worn look of places operating on stripped margins? Fourth pass, personnel. The men who weren't shopping or working. The ones who moved between locations without obvious purpose, whose eyes tracked strangers the way Evans did. He counted 6 of them across the 6-block area, probably more further out. By 9 a.m., he was back at the motel, filling 3 pages of the moleskin with tight notation. By 10, he had a rough organizational map. Not complete, not confirmed, but a working hypothesis about the syndicate's street-level structure that he could refine over the next several days. His knee had gone from an ache to a specific burning complaint by the time he sat down. He stretched it mechanically, the way the physical therapist had shown him, with the disciplined joylessness of a person performing maintenance on equipment they didn't choose. Shadow put his head in Evan's lap. Evan put his hand on the dog's head without looking down. "I know," he said again. "Boss, Detective Claire Donovan called at 11:15. Decker's lawyer had him out by 9 this morning," she said without preamble. Evan had expected it, but hearing it stated plainly still produced a specific feeling, not quite anger, more like the confirmation of a pattern. On what? Insufficient evidence of criminal threat. His lawyer argued the physical altercation was initiated by your dog, and that his client was merely engaged in a business dispute. A pause. "I'm telling you what the paperwork says. I'm not telling you I agree with it." "Who's his lawyer?" "Philip Crane. He represents about 60% of the criminal defense cases in this county, including, historically, several cases connected to Salazar's operations that somehow never resulted in convictions." Evan was quiet for a moment. "How connected is the judiciary?" Another pause, longer. "That's a complicated question, Mr. Mercer." "You said that yesterday, about a different question." "A lot of things in Grayport are complicated. Or they're simple, and the complication is who gets hurt when you simplify them." She didn't answer that. He heard her exhale, not quite a sigh, something more deliberate than that. The sound of a person who has been holding something for too long and is deciding how much of it to set down. "Sofia Alvarez came in this morning," Donovan said. "Filed a formal statement. She's brave. She documented everything." "Good. It may not matter. We've had statements before. Witnesses recant. Evidence gets procedurally challenged. Crane is very good at what he does." "So is Salazar, apparently." "Victor Salazar," Donovan said, and her voice changed slightly. A tightening, the way a person's voice changes when they say the name of something they're genuinely afraid of, has been operating in this county for 11 years. In those 11 years, he has been indicted twice. Both times, the key witness either disappeared or changed their testimony before trial. He currently operates through 14 registered businesses: a property management company, 2 restaurants, a private security firm, a shipping logistics company. She paused again. The private security firm holds contracts with 3 city departments. Evan absorbed that. "You're telling me he's inside the city infrastructure?" "I'm telling you the situation is complicated," she said. Then quieter. I'm also telling you to be careful. What you did yesterday, people saw it, and word travels fast in this city, not always in the direction you'd want. Appreciate it, Evan said. Don't thank me. I'm not doing you a favor. I'm managing a situation. A beat. Don't leave town, mister. Mercer. She hung up. Evan set the phone down and looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then he picked up the moleskin and added 3 more lines under Salazar. Oh. Sophia found him at the diner that afternoon. He'd come back partly because Miguel's green chile was genuinely excellent, and partly because the diner's corner booth gave him the best surveillance position on the Clement Avenue corridor he'd found so far. Sophia came in from the kitchen, not the front. She'd been helping her father prep flour on her forearm, hair pulled back with the pragmatic efficiency of someone who hadn't had time to think about it. She sat down across from him without asking. He noticed the bruising on her throat. She was wearing a collared shirt, deliberate choice, or maybe just what she'd grabbed. Either way, the collar didn't quite cover the discoloration along her jawline. She saw him notice and didn't react to it, which told him she'd already made peace with it being visible. You're still here, she said. Still here. Most people would have left. Most people don't have a specific reason to stay, Evan said. I'm developing one. She studied him across the table with the directness of someone who had been trained to assess patients quickly and had carried that habit into regular life. Who were you before? Navy. Special operations? He looked at her. What makes you say that? The way you move. The way you watched those men for 10 minutes before you did anything. She paused. My cousin did 2 tours, Marines. He moves differently than you. You're quieter. Even when you're standing still, you're quieter. Your cousin's probably fine, Evan said. He is. He's in Portland now, has a family. She folded her hands on the table. How bad is your injury? The question landed with unexpected directness, and he found himself genuinely unprepared for it, which didn't happen often. Excuse me? You favored your left leg getting up from the booth yesterday. And again this morning when you walked past the window around 7 a.m., I was doing prep, I saw you from the back. You compensate for it well, but you compensate. She shrugged, and there was something almost apologetic in it. 2nd year of med school, gait analysis. Evan considered her for a moment. Knee, he said. Combat injury, mostly functional. Mostly, she repeated. Enough. She accepted that. What are you planning to do? Learn more before I decide. Salazar won't give you time to learn. Probably not, Evan agreed, but he also doesn't know yet what he's dealing with. That gap's useful while it lasts. Sophia was quiet for a moment. Then, my father wants me to go to my aunt's in Sacramento. Wait until this blows over. Is that what you want? She looked out the window at the gray harbor. No, she said simply. This is our restaurant. My grandfather built the booths in this room with his hands. I'm not going to Sacramento and waiting for Victor Salazar to decide when I can come home. Evan drank his coffee. Tell your father I'd like to see the payment records, he said. Whatever documentation he kept. Dates, amounts, who came, what was said, everything. He kept records? Business owners usually do. Even when they're scared. Especially when they're scared. He paused. It's how people hold on to the idea that someday someone will care about the evidence. She looked at him for a moment with an expression he couldn't entirely classify. Not gratitude, something more complicated than that and more careful. Okay, she said. Then, what's your dog's name? Shadow. She looked under the table. Shadow looked back at her with his customary serene attention. Hi, Shadow, she said softly. Shadow's tail moved once, a single controlled sweep. Sophia stood up, smoothed her apron, and went back to the kitchen. The records were more complete than Evan had expected and more damning than Miguel had seemed to realize. Miguel had been keeping a ledger, handwritten, hidden in the false bottom of the supply closet behind the cooking oil, that documented 43 separate payments over 7 months. Dates, amounts, the name or description of whoever collected. He'd included small details that a lawyer would call corroborating specifics, what the collector was wearing, what vehicle they arrived in, exact times. He'd done it, he explained to Evan quietly, because his own father had taught him that when you're doing something under duress, you write it down, because someday someone might need to know. Your father was right, Evan said. Miguel looked at the ledger with the expression of a man seeing something he'd created, hoping he'd never need to use it. Does it help? Significantly? Evan photographed every page with his phone, methodically, in sequence, making sure each image was sharp and fully legible before moving to the next. Old habit from intelligence work. Documentation is only as useful as its reproducibility. He'd upload everything to an encrypted cloud folder tonight. 2 backups, minimum. You didn't tell Donovan about this? Miguel shifted. Detective Donovan is... She seems honest, but she's inside a system that isn't. Fair, Evan said. He couldn't argue with the logic. He spent that evening doing something that looked from the outside like a middle-aged man walking his dog along the waterfront in the rain, which was accurate as far as it went. What it didn't capture was the level of systematic observation occurring during that walk. Evan had identified 4 locations that Salazar's street teams used as informal staging points, and he spent 2 hours confirming the timing patterns he'd hypothesized that morning. The crews ran in 8-hour rotations. Shift changes happened at roughly 6 a.m., 2 p.m., and 10 p.m. The transition windows, 15 to 20 minutes where personnel were moving between positions, were the intervals of minimum coverage. That was useful. He also identified something he hadn't expected, a pattern of movement in and out of a shipping facility 3 blocks from the harbor pier. Salazar's legitimate logistics business, according to Donovan's description. Trucks that arrived late and left early, with no obvious corresponding inventory flow from the adjacent loading dock. Personnel who didn't move like logistics workers, too alert, too deliberate, the specific body language of men being paid to watch something rather than move something. He stood at the end of the pier for 5 minutes in the rain, watching the facility's lights. Shadow sat at his side, wet and entirely unbothered by it. Something was being moved through that facility that wasn't listed on any legitimate manifest. Evan had seen enough of these operations overseas, in port cities, in border towns, in places where criminal infrastructure used commercial legitimacy as a shell, to recognize the shape of it without needing to see inside. The question was the specifics. The question was always the specifics. The car was waiting outside his motel when he got back. Not the white van. That one he'd identified as surveillance. This was different. A black Escalade, no plates visible from his approach angle, engine running, parked directly in front of his room door in a way that was clearly deliberate. A man leaned against the driver's door. Large, rain jacket, arms crossed, the specific bored confidence of a professional who has done this particular thing many times. Evan stopped walking about 30 feet out. Shadow stopped beside him, head up, body still. The man by the Escalade didn't move. He looked at Evan with the patient expression of someone who had been told to wait, and had no particular feelings about waiting. The rear passenger window went down. "Mr. Mercer." The voice from inside was measured, almost pleasant, with the careful articulation of someone who had spent years making sure they never said anything that could be quoted against them. "I wonder if you'd be willing to have a brief conversation." Evan walked to the window. The man inside was perhaps 60, silver-haired, dressed in the specific understated way of people who can afford anything and have chosen things that announce nothing. He had the kind of face that would be impossible to describe after the fact. Not because anything was wrong with it, but because everything about it had been engineered, through decades of practiced neutrality, to leave no impression. He was looking at Evan with what might have been curiosity. "Victor Salazar," Evan said. Not a question. "I prefer to introduce myself." The man's mouth curved slightly. Not quite a smile. "But yes, I understand you've been asking about me." "I've been listening," Evan said. "People keep bringing you up. You made quite an impression yesterday." Marco has always had a tendency toward a brief pause. Excess. "I want you to know that I found his actions yesterday to be poor judgment. He works for you. Many people work for me. I can't personally supervise every interaction." Salazar's tone was the tone of a man explaining something to someone he's decided to be patient with. "But I understand the optics were unfortunate. The girl's throat was bruised this morning. Hmm? Salazar looked out the front windshield for a moment. A regrettable situation. I'd like to offer some recompense to the Alvarez family for any disruption, and to you for any inconvenience. Evan looked at him steadily. What kind of recompense? The practical kind. Miguel's payment obligation reduced for the next several months. An acknowledgement that the situation was mishandled. Salazar turned back to him. And for you, personally, whatever would make your stay in Greyport more comfortable. I understand you're between situations. A man with your background and skills can always find productive application. A job offer. Evan held Salazar's gaze for a moment. The man was good, genuinely good, in the way that people who have operated at high level for a long time get good. The offer was calibrated, specific enough to be real, vague enough to be deniable, wrapped in the language of generosity to obscure what it actually was, which was a purchase. I'm comfortable, Evan said. Salazar studied him. Mr. Mercer. The pleasantness in his voice remained perfectly intact, which somehow made it more unsettling than anger would have been. I want you to understand something. This city has a functioning economy. People have livelihoods, families. The arrangements that exist here, whatever you may think of them, provide a kind of stability. When outside elements disturb that stability, the people who suffer first are always the ones at the bottom. He paused. The Alvarez family. The Vietnamese gentleman with the coffee cart. The families on Clement Avenue. They suffer first. I've noticed that they're already suffering, Evan said. Then you understand the wisdom of careful management. What I understand, Evan said, is that you drove to a cheap motel to talk to a veteran you've never met, and you brought your biggest guy to stand outside while you did it. He straightened up from the window. Careful management would have been a phone call. Salazar looked at him for a long moment. Something shifted. Not in his expression, which remained perfectly calibrated, but in his eyes. A very slight recalibration, the look of a man who has just updated an assessment. Think about it, Salazar said. The window went up. The Escalade pulled out of the parking lot without hurrying, and Evan watched it until the taillights disappeared around the corner onto Harbor Street. He stood there in the rain for a moment. Shadow pressed his flank lightly against Evan's leg. A contact, not a command. Just presence. Evan's knee ached. His ribs, where the cold was getting into the old brake lines, had graduated from background noise to foreground complaint. He was tired in the specific way that accumulated over days of low sleep and high alertness. Not the crashing exhaustion of acute crisis, but the grinding slow drain of sustained vigilance. He looked at the door of his motel room. Thought about the ledger photographs on his phone. Thought about the shipping facility and its wrong-feeling traffic patterns. Thought about a 15-year-old girl and her mother who'd been listed in one of the pattern anomalies he'd noted near the facility. 2 individuals brought in through the back entrance after midnight, logged against a vehicle registered to one of Salazar's shell companies. Not logistics. People. He unlocked his room door, went inside, sat at the small desk and opened the moleskin to a new page. He wrote, Facility, SE Corner, 3 blocks pier, confirm. Underlined it twice. Then he wrote the number he'd counted from tonight's observation. 2 confirmed. Possibly more. He put the pen down and looked at the wall for a while. The listening device on the nightstand continued its quiet, useless transmission to whatever receiver was parked somewhere nearby, picking up nothing but the rain against the window and the slow, even breathing of an old dog who had decided the floor beside the bed was acceptable and had settled in with the uncomplicated peace of an animal that had already done its day's work. Evan rubbed his face with both hands. Then he picked up his phone and called Donovan. She answered on the second ring, which meant she'd been awake. Tell me about the shipping facility on Pier 7, he said. A silence. Why? She said. Because I think the extortion is a revenue stream, Evan said. I don't think it's the business. Another silence. Longer. When she spoke again, her voice was different. Lower and careful in a way that had nothing to do with discretion and everything to do with something that sounded, under the professional surface of it, like fear. Where are you right now? My room. Don't go near that facility. She said it precisely. Do you understand me? Whatever you think you saw, do not go near it. Tell me why. Because 3 months ago, she said, a patrol officer named Reyes filed an incident report about suspicious vehicle activity near Pier 7. He included the plate numbers. A pause. Reyes was killed in a traffic accident 6 weeks later. Single vehicle. No witnesses. Another pause. The incident report disappeared from the system before the accident investigation was closed. The rain fell. Donovan, Evan said. What? How long have you known about this? The silence that followed lasted long enough that it became its own kind of answer. Go to sleep, Mr. Mercer, she said finally. She hung up. Evan set the phone down carefully. He looked at Shadow, who had opened one eye at the sound of the call, and now watched Evan with the patient readiness of an animal that had learned over years of service that phone calls sometimes preceded movement. Not tonight, Evan said quietly. Shadow closed his eye. Evan looked at the wall, at the moleskin, at the phone. Officer Reyes, incident report. Plate numbers, 6 weeks, no witnesses. He picked up the pen and wrote one more line at the bottom of the page. They're not just watching, they're cleaning. He didn't sleep much. Not because of the pain, though the knee was running a low-grade complaint that the ibuprofen wasn't fully touching anymore. Not because of fear. Fear was a thing Evan had spent years learning to metabolize quickly, convert into usable fuel, then move past. He didn't sleep much because his brain had shifted into the particular operational mode that 11 years of training had grooved so deep into his neural architecture that it now activated involuntarily, like breathing, whenever a situation reached a certain threshold of complexity. The threshold had been crossed somewhere around the moment Donovan said the incident report disappeared from the system. He lay on the motel bed with the lights off, Shadow's slow breathing audible from the floor, and he built the picture in his head the way he used to build target packages, not from the center out, but from the edges in. Start with what you can confirm. Work toward what you can only infer. Never mistake the inference for the confirmation. What he could confirm: Salazar ran extortion across a significant portion of Grayport's small business community. He had legal representation that had successfully killed 2 prior indictments. He had personnel inside city infrastructure through the private security contracts. He had a shipping facility that moved something other than legitimate cargo, a patrol officer who'd noticed the facility was dead, and his report was gone. What he could infer: the facility was the center of mass. The extortion was a perimeter. Money, yes, but also control. Keep the businesses scared, keep the community fragmented, keep everyone's head down so nobody looks too long at the pier. What he didn't know yet: the scale, the specific supply chains, whether Donovan was compromised or just afraid, how deep the judicial connections ran, and the question that mattered most operationally: who else inside Salazar's organization was capable of what had happened to Reyes? Because that wasn't street-level enforcement. That was something more deliberate, more patient. He turned that over for a while. Around 3 a.m, Shadow got up, circled once, and pressed himself against the side of the bed, his version of checking in. Evan put his hand down in the dark and felt the dog's head find it, the familiar warmth of it, the specific texture of the fur between Shadow's ears that Evan could have identified blind. "We're okay," Evan said quietly. Shadow was unconvinced but polite about it. Evan stared at the ceiling until the light through the curtains started to gray, and then he got up. The next 4 days were methodical, not dramatic, not the kind of thing that would look like much from the outside. A man walking the same streets, eating at the same diner, having quiet conversations with people who were cautious at first and then, gradually, less so. But underneath the surface routine, Evan was doing something he'd once heard a senior chief describe as building the map that matters. Not geography, not org charts, but the living network of who knew what, who talked to whom, who was afraid of which specific thing, and why. Tuan, the coffee cart operator, had a brother-in-law who drove for one of Salazar's logistics contractors. He hadn't mentioned this the first morning, but brought it up himself on the 3rd day, unprompted, as if he'd been deciding whether to and had finally landed on yes. The brother-in-law's name was Pham. He drove a route that included Pier 7 twice a week, late runs, always the same time window. He'd stopped talking about his job 8 months ago. Rosa Mendez ran the Mexican grocery 2 blocks from the diner. She'd been paying protection for 9 months and had twice attempted to file complaints with the city, both times being told, politely, professionally, that without corroborating evidence, there was little that could be done. She had the business cards of 2 different city officials who had said helpful things and done nothing. She kept them in a drawer behind the register, she told Evan, because throwing them away felt like giving up, and keeping them felt like evidence. She was right on the second count. An older man named Harlan ran the hardware store on the corner. He was 68, a Vietnam-era Army veteran, and he was the most overtly angry of anyone Evan spoke to. A specific, controlled, long-burning anger that came from watching something happen over a long period while being systematically unable to stop it. He'd confronted Salazar's people twice in the early months. The second confrontation had resulted in his storefront window being broken at 2 in the morning and a cat, his wife's, she'd had it 12 years, being left on his doorstep the next morning. "They didn't hurt it," Harlan said. He was behind his register, talking to the space between Evan and the door rather than at Evan directly. "Just left it there, so I'd know they'd been in the house." Evan was quiet for a moment. "You served," Evan said. "2 tours. Harlan glanced at him. "You?" 11 years. Harlan nodded slowly. He'd already done the math on Evan from the way he stood, the way he'd walked through the store. "What are you actually doing here?" "Learning," Evan said. Harlan was quiet. Then, "There used to be a neighborhood watch, 12 people. Salazar's lawyers sent a letter. Civil liability exposure for any interactions with persons engaged in protected business activities, something like that. 8 of the 12 quit the same week." He straightened a display rack that didn't need straightening. The other 4 kept meeting. 2 of them had things happen. 1 moved his family out in October. "Who's the 4th? Harlan looked at him for a long moment. Then he reached under the counter and wrote a name and address on the back of a receipt. Evan took it. "You carrying?" Harlan asked, nodding at Evan's jacket. "No." Harlan looked at him like that was either admirable or insane and hadn't decided which. "You probably should be." Probably," Evan agreed. He folded the receipt into his pocket. "But it changes the math in ways I'm not ready to change it yet." He left the hardware store and walked back to the motel. He was 2 blocks away when the black Escalade went past him. Slowly, without stopping, the tinted windows giving nothing. It turned left at the next corner. Evan continued walking at the same pace and didn't look after it. His phone buzzed. Unknown number, he answered. "You talked to Harlan Briggs today." The voice was male, flat, with a quality of professional disinterest that Evan associated with people who had been in some form of enforcement work and had left the emotional investment of it behind somewhere along the way. Not Salazar's voice. Someone further down. "I bought sandpaper," Evan said. A pause. "Mr. Salazar's offer stands. That won't be true indefinitely. I appreciate the timeline. Mr. Mercer." The voice sharpened slightly. "You're a veteran with a medical discharge and a dog. Whatever you think is happening here, you're one person, in a city where the people who tried to make trouble before you have had very bad luck. Is that a specific threat or a general observation? Consider it information." The call ended. Evan looked at the phone for a moment, then pocketed it. He'd expected the escalation. He'd been in their sightlines for almost a week, talking to their revenue sources, and patience, however tactically sound, had a ceiling. The call meant the ceiling was lowering. He needed to move faster. The man from Harlan's receipt was named Dennis Kuo, 41 years old, who ran a small tax and accounting practice out of a converted Victorian on Maple Street, and who opened his door to Evan with the particular wariness of someone who had been told to expect a knock he wouldn't like, and was still surprised when it actually arrived. Dennis was thin, precise in his movements, with the slightly exhausted look of a man managing more than his system was designed for. He stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at Evan, looking at Shadow, and then stepped aside to let them both in without saying anything. His office was meticulous, files aligned, desktop clear, the kind of order that comes from needing to control at least one thing when other things are out of control. He already knew who Evan was. The diner story had circulated faster and further than Evan had tracked. "Harlan trusts you," Dennis said. He sat behind his desk. Didn't offer coffee. "That's not nothing. I appreciate it. What do you want from me?" Evan sat across from him. "You do books for some of the businesses on the payment list?" Dennis didn't ask how Evan knew that. "Some of them." "Then you've seen the financial damage." "I've seen what protection payments do to a thin-margin business over 9 months, yes." Dennis's voice was precisely neutral. The voice of a man presenting data without attaching his feelings to it, because attaching feelings to it hadn't helped. Rosa Mendez was 3 weeks from closing in December. Miguel nearly couldn't make payroll twice. There's a Thai family, the Sawanakits, who run a small hotel near the pier. They've mortgaged personal assets twice in the last 6 months. Donovan knows about these families? Detective Donovan knows a great many things, Dennis said carefully. Knowing and doing are different activities. She told me she was afraid the judiciary was compromised. She told you that? Something shifted in Dennis's expression. She doesn't usually... He stopped. That's significant. Why? Because Donovan has been running a parallel file on Salazar's operations for 2 years. He said it like someone releasing pressure from a valve. Not official, her own documentation. She's been building a case she can't file because she doesn't trust the chain. He paused. If she told you about Reyes, she did. Then she's scared enough to trust a stranger. He looked at Evan steadily. That should tell you something about how bad it's gotten. Shadow had settled on the office floor and was watching Dennis with the serene evaluation of a dog who had decided the room was safe but was reserving full comfort for later. The facility on Pier 7, Evan said. You do books for any of the businesses adjacent to it? A silence. The shipping manifest, Dennis said slowly, for Salazar's logistics company. I've seen 2 of them, indirectly, through a client whose warehouse abuts that property. The manifests don't line up with the truck schedules. He was looking somewhere above Evan's left shoulder, the look of someone organizing thoughts they'd been holding for a long time. I'm an accountant. I notice when numbers don't reconcile. The declared cargo weight per run is consistently lighter than it should be given the vehicle loading I can see from the adjacent property. Lighter, which means either the trucks are running half empty, expensive and operationally unusual, or the declared cargo isn't the actual cargo. Evan nodded slowly. How many runs a week? That I've been able to document through my clients' records. 3 to 4 outbound. The inbound is harder to track. Those happen at night. People don't move outbound, Evan said. They move inbound. Dennis looked at him. Something in his expression acknowledged the shape of what Evan was saying without wanting to say it himself. I'm an accountant, he said again, quietly. I know, Evan said. You've done more than most people in this city. He stood up. Shadow stood with him. Mr. Mercer. Dennis turned a pen over in his fingers, end to end, a nervous gesture he probably wasn't aware of. Whatever you're building toward, be careful who you tell it to. Inside the department, Donovan is the only one I'd trust, and even that's... He stopped. Complicated, Evan said. Yes. Evan left the office and walked out into the afternoon air, which had finally, after a week of rain, broken open into a cold, pale gray that wasn't exactly sunshine, but wasn't actively falling on him either. A minor improvement. He stood on Dennis's front step for a moment, watching a crow work at something in the gutter across the street. He thought about Pier 7. He thought about inbound trucks at night and manifests that didn't reconcile, and an officer named Reyes who'd written down plate numbers. He thought about the 2 individuals he'd logged going through the back entrance 6 days ago. Then he went back to the motel and got to work. What followed were 3 days of the most careful surveillance work Evan had done outside of an actual operational context, which was a sentence that carried more weight than it might seem because actual operational context had included a coastal compound in the Persian Gulf and a river transit route in Southeast Asia that officially had never happened. He used no equipment he hadn't arrived with. No assets, no support, No radio check-ins to a base element. Just him, Shadow, a pair of binoculars, the moleskin, and the kind of disciplined patience that most people couldn't sustain for more than 40 minutes, but that Evan had ground into himself through years of holds in place, where moving at the wrong moment meant people didn't come home. He ran the facility from 3 observation points, rotating to avoid pattern establishment. He timed the truck arrivals down to the minute. He documented the personnel on the gate, 2 at night, 1 during the day, with a floating third who moved in and out of a side entrance on no predictable schedule, which meant supervisor, not line worker. He mapped the exterior lighting and its gaps. On the second day, he identified something he'd missed from distance, a secondary structure behind the main warehouse, accessible through an internal passage that was never opened during daylight hours. The passage had a keypad lock and a camera above it, but the camera was fixed, not panning, which gave a blind corner off the left approach that the installer had probably never considered, because they were mounting hardware, not conducting tactical analysis of their own facility. On the third day, at 0440, during what he'd identified as the lowest density personnel window, he went in. Not far, not all the way, just close enough to confirm. He left Shadow secured at the observation point. A difficult choice because Shadow's detection capability would have been useful, but the dog's movement noise in a confined approach was a variable he couldn't control well enough. He went in alone, using the blind corner he'd mapped, through a ventilation access point that hadn't been properly sealed against the original concrete work and which yielded to steady pressure without tools. He was inside for 11 minutes. When he came out, he went directly to the observation point, collected Shadow, and walked the long way back to the motel without stopping. He sat in the motel room and wrote in the moleskin for 20 minutes with the focused deliberateness of a man trying to get everything down before the adrenaline conversion finished, and left him with just the weight of what he'd seen. What he'd confirmed, in those 11 minutes, 2 holding rooms, both occupied. He hadn't been able to count individuals accurately in the dark, but heat signatures suggested at minimum 4 people in the first room, 3 in the second. Food containers near the door of each, a portable chemical toilet, cable lock restraints on the wall anchors. Not logistics. People. Held in a commercial facility 3 blocks from the Grayport waterfront, behind a keypad and a camera and a shipping manifest that said electrical components. He put the pen down. He called Donovan. "I need to meet," he said. Not on the phone. She was quiet for exactly 2 seconds. "The park on Mercer Street, half hour." He almost said something about the street name. Didn't. She was already there when he arrived, sitting on a bench with a coffee she wasn't drinking, her coat collar up against the cold, looking like a woman who had been awake for a while and had stopped noticing. He sat down beside her. Shadow positioned himself at Evan's feet, facing outward. He told her what he'd found. All of it. The observation schedule, the personnel pattern, the blind corner, what he'd seen inside. He laid it out in the same clipped, sequential way he'd briefed Mission Intel, without embellishment, without asking her to react before he'd finished. When he was done, she was quiet for a long time. "You went inside," she said. "I did." "That's—" She stopped. "Evidence obtained that way. I'm not testifying about how I found it. I'm telling you what's there. You find another way to the probable cause." He looked at her. "The people in those rooms don't have time for procedural workarounds." She closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them, she was looking at the park's empty path rather than at him. "I've had suspicions about Pier 7 for 14 months. I filed 3 requests for surveillance authorization. All 3 were denied. I don't know if it's the commander or above the commander, but something's killing it before it gets to a judge I trust." "Which judges do you trust?" 2, both in County Superior. Getting a warrant to them without going through the normal channel. She pressed her lips together. "It's possible. But if Salazar's people see the application moving through an irregular path, they'll have 48 hours warning minimum. Those rooms will be empty." "So it has to be simultaneous," Evan said. "Warrant execution and facility entry at the same moment. That requires tactical resources I can't deploy without command authorization." "What about federal?" She looked at him. "If there's trafficking across state lines," Evan said, "that's FBI jurisdiction. You go around the county structure entirely." She was quiet for a moment. "I have a contact. We were at a task force briefing 18 months ago. She's out of the Seattle field office. She paused. If I go to her with what I have, what you've told me, and it goes sideways, if someone in Salazar's network has a federal contact too, then we're having this conversation for nothing anyway. She looked at him. Something moved through her expression. Not agreement exactly, but the recognition of a logic she couldn't answer. I need documentation, she said. Whatever you have. He gave her the encrypted photo folder access. The ledger pages, his moleskin transcriptions of the observation logs, the timing data on the trucks. She looked at her phone as the files loaded with the expression of someone watching a number they've been waiting to appear finally arrive on a display. This is solid, she said quietly. The ledger alone puts Decker and two others at the diner on specific dates with specific demands. That's a start. It's more than a start. She stood, tucked her coffee into a trash bin beside the bench. Give me 48 hours. People are in those rooms, Donovan. I know. Her voice was flat. Give me 48 hours. She walked away without looking back. He watched her go, then looked down at Shadow, who was watching a squirrel across the path with philosophical patience. Don't, Evan said. Shadow sighed through his nose and looked elsewhere. The 48 hours did not hold. 18 hours in, at 7:14 in the evening, Evan was eating at the diner when his phone showed a news alert from the local Grayport Observer's breaking feed. He opened it. Fire reported at Clement Avenue Business. Firefighters on scene. No casualties reported. He was at the window in 3 steps. The smoke was visible from the diner's front glass, not 1 block away, rolling black and orange against the dark sky, lit from below by the kind of light that means the structure is already compromised. The sirens were already layering over each other from 3 directions. Miguel came out of the kitchen with flowers still on his apron and saw Evan's face before he saw the smoke and said nothing at all, just stood there while his daughter came out behind him. And then Sophia saw the glow through the window and her hand went to her mouth. Stay here, Evan said. He was out the door before Miguel could answer. The burning building wasn't the diner. It was the Sawanakit family's hotel. 3 stories, old wood frame construction, the kind of building that goes up fast and mean. Evan could feel the heat from half a block away. Firefighters were setting up, but the building was already fully involved on the ground floor, and there were people on the sidewalk in night clothes, some of them crying, some of them standing with the blank shock of people who have just lost everything they own. He scanned the crowd, did a rapid count. A woman, Mrs. Sawanakit, he recognized her from passing conversations on the street, was speaking rapidly to a firefighter and pointing back at the building, and the firefighter was holding her arm, and the body language of both of them was specific and clear. Someone was still inside. He caught one word in the confusion. Nong, her daughter's name. He'd seen the girl once, 14 or 15, shy, who helped with front desk check-in on weekends. The firefighter was on his radio. The building's front entrance was completely engulfed. Evan was already moving toward the side. The side alley was narrower and the smoke was heavier there, but the first floor window was intact. Single hung, the old kind, painted shut probably, but that was a problem he knew how to solve. He pulled his jacket over his face, took a breath, and broke the window with his elbow in the specific angle that keeps glass from cutting you, and went through. Inside was different from outside. The noise of the fire was immense from inside. Not the crackling sound of movie fires, but a sustained structural roar, like wind through a tunnel, the sound of something actively consuming. The smoke was dense at ceiling level and dropping. He stayed low. The heat was working through the floor from below, which told him the ground floor was lost and he had a ceiling on how long he had. He called out once, heard nothing, called again. Then, from above, a sound. Not a shout, more like an impact repeated, something hitting a surface. He found the stairs. The handrail was hot to the touch, which meant the wall behind it was compromised, which meant he had less time than he'd hoped. He went up fast, staying on the structural edge of the treads where they were strongest, one hand on the wall for position. 2nd floor. Smoke darker here. He dropped lower, moved by memory of the building's exterior dimensions, counting doors. 3rd door on the right was locked from inside. He hit it at the hinge side with his shoulder. his right shoulder, some remaining operational instinct keeping the left side clear, and the old frame gave on the second impact. The girl was at the window. She'd been trying to break it. She was coughing badly and her eyes were running, and she was 14 years old and absolutely terrified. And when she saw him, she made a sound that Evan would think about later. "Come here," he said. "Right now. Stay with me." She came. He got her to the stairs. The hallway was worse than it had been 40 seconds ago. The fire had moved up the stairwell wall, and the smoke was thickening toward opaque. He put her in front of him, one hand on her shoulder guiding, stayed bent low, moved fast. The stairs groaned under them. One tread gave slightly, and he felt the specific sickening sense of a structure losing integrity beneath him and pushed through it because there was no alternative to through. Out the side window. He went first, turned, caught her by the arms as she came through, and they were in the alley, and the cold night air hit them both like something physical. She collapsed against him, coughing. He kept her upright, walked her toward the street, toward the lights, toward the firefighters who came running when they saw him emerge from the alley with the girl. Mrs. Suwanakit's sound when she saw her daughter was not something that had words around it. Evan stepped back. Let the paramedics move in. His right shoulder was complaining from the door impact, and his ribs, where the cold and the smoke had gotten into the old damage, were announcing themselves with specificity. His eyes were burning. He probably looked terrible. A paramedic touched his arm. "Sir, let us check you." "I'm okay." He clearly wasn't entirely okay, but he was standing and the girl was safe, and those were the relevant metrics. He found a spot away from the immediate response activity and sat on a concrete barrier and tried to breathe steadily. Shadow had been at the diner entrance, Evan realized. He'd gone out without him, which he now processed as a mistake, because Shadow had always been his secondary exit strategy, and the habit of moving alone was one he'd have to recalibrate. His phone buzzed. Donovan. "Where are you?" she said. "Suwanakit fire." A pause. "Are you hurt?" "No, girl's okay." "What happened?" "We don't know yet, but—" She stopped. He heard her breathing. "Evan, Miguel's restaurant." He was standing before she finished the sentence. "They hit it too," she said. "Different accelerant, different timing. 30 minutes ago. It was already burning when anyone called it in." Another pause. "Miguel and Sofia are okay. They were at the diner when it started." He stood in the alley, smoke still rising above the roofline of the hotel behind him, sirens overlapping from two directions, the cold air doing nothing to touch the specific heat building in his chest that wasn't from the fire. "This was a message," Donovan said. He didn't answer that. It wasn't a question. "My contact at the Seattle field office." Donovan's voice was steady in the way that people get steady when steadiness is a decision rather than a state. "I called her 3 hours ago. She wants a meeting. Tomorrow morning." She paused. "But Salazar moved tonight, which means someone told him I made contact." Evan stared at the smoke-colored sky above the buildings. "There's a leak," he said. "Yes." "Inside your department." The silence that followed was the specific silence of someone confirming something they had suspected for a long time, and had hoped for a long time that they were wrong about. "Yes," she said again. He closed his eyes for exactly 1 second, opened them. "Then the next move is the FBI contact, and nothing goes through your department. Nothing." "Agreed," she paused. "There's something else. 30 minutes ago, Decker showed up at the diner. He came in after the fire started." Evan went still. "He spoke to Sofia," Donovan said. "She recorded it on her phone." Evan. She said his first name for the first time, and the specific way she said it told him something before the words arrived. He told her that her father has until Friday to sign over the restaurant deed and leave Grayport. And he told her, a breath. He told her that you're next, and that the dog dies first, so you watch. The street noise continued around him. Ambulance lights, a firefighter shouting something about pressure, a crowd of neighborhood people standing in the cold watching a building burn. Evan's hand tightened around the phone. Shadow was at the diner. Sophia was at the diner. Miguel was at the diner. "I'm on my way," he said. "Evan," she said it sharply, like she'd learned something about him in these few days. "Don't do something that puts everything else at risk." "I'm not going to do anything," he said. "Tonight." He started walking. The diner was still standing. That was the first thing Evan registered when he turned the corner onto Clement Avenue, the Alvarez family diner, with its hand-painted letters and its chalk menu board, was intact. No smoke, no broken windows, no crowd of people standing on the sidewalk with that specific empty look of people watching something they built become something they can't fix. It was intact because Salazar hadn't burned it. Not yet. The burning was the warning. The restaurant itself was the leverage, the thing still standing that he could take if the warning wasn't heeded. Evan understood the logic immediately, and the understanding produced a cold, precise anger that he set aside for later use. Miguel was inside, behind the counter, both hands flat on the surface in a posture Evan had come to associate with him in moments of extreme stress, like his hands needed to know the wood was still there. Two of the counter stools were occupied by people from the neighborhood who had come in off the street, not for coffee, but for the specific gravity that community pulls toward in emergencies. Sophia was at the far end of the counter with her phone in her hand, and when she saw Evan come through the door, she straightened in a way that mixed relief with something more complicated. Shadow crossed the room to Evan immediately, pressed against his leg with an intensity that told Evan the dog had been unsettled since he'd left without him. "Sorry," Evan said quietly, putting his hand on the dog's head. To Shadow, not to the room. Sophia looked at his jacket, the smoke smell, the ash along his forearm, the way he was holding his right shoulder slightly tilted. "You went into the hotel. The girl's okay?" "I heard." She set her phone on the counter. "Decker was here." "I know, Donovan told me." He looked at her directly. "You recorded it." "Didn't even think about it. Just..." She touched the side of her phone reflexively. "He was talking, and I just started it. My hand did it." "Good instinct. That recording matters." Miguel looked up from his hands. His eyes had the flat, careful quality of a man who has moved past fear into the territory beyond it, where the options have narrowed enough that the math becomes simple. "He wants me to sign the building over." "I heard." "The building is everything. My father's... This is everything we have." "I know." "So tell me what we do." Miguel's voice didn't crack. He said it straightforwardly, the way a man asks for a tool he knows how to use once he has it. "Because I'm 61 years old and I've been scared for 7 months, and I've done nothing, and Nong Sawanakit is 12 years old and she almost burned to death tonight. So tell me what we do." The two neighbors at the counter were listening. Everyone in the room was listening. And Evan was aware of it, and was aware that whatever he said next was going to carry weight he'd have to be honest about rather than comforting. "There's a federal contact," Evan said. "Meeting tomorrow morning. If it holds, and if the documentation we have is enough, we can move this to a jurisdiction Salazar doesn't control." He paused. "If. And if it doesn't hold?" Evan didn't answer that immediately. "Let's make it hold," he said. He didn't go back to the motel. He stayed in the diner until midnight, not because it made the building safer, but because presence mattered, and because the neighborhood people who filtered in and out over the next 3 hours seemed to find something steadying in the fact of him sitting in booth 9 with his dog and his coffee and his worn jacket, not visibly afraid. He wasn't performing calm. He was genuinely metabolizing the situation at an operational tempo, which looked like calm from outside but was a different thing internally. He used the time. He reviewed everything Donovan had sent him about her FBI contact, Agent Karen Yee, 12 years with the Bureau, currently assigned to the Seattle Violent Crimes Task Force that included a human trafficking division. Yee had worked 2 cases with overlapping signatures to what Evan had documented at Pier 7. Small-scale trafficking operations using commercial logistics infrastructure as cover, operating in port-adjacent communities where the jurisdiction overlap between local and federal authority created procedural gaps. This was not a gap Salazar had discovered. It was a gap he had engineered. The private security contracts with 3 city departments, Evan pulled those on the county contractor database, which was public record, and cross-referenced the contract award dates with the dates on Miguel's payment ledger. The first protection payment had been collected 4 months after Salazar's security firm was awarded its first city contract. Not coincidence. Sequencing. The contracts came first to establish the relationships, to build the dependencies, to position people inside the system who would be useful when the pressure needed to be applied. He wrote it down, organized it into a sequence that told the same story, the individual pieces told but more clearly, the way a good intelligence product synthesized raw collection into something a decision maker could use. Around 1 in the morning, when the last neighbor had gone home, and Miguel had finally been persuaded to sleep in the back office rather than sit vigil at his own counter, Sophia brought a fresh coffee to booth 9 and sat across from Evan. She looked at the moleskin, open on the table in front of him, the pages of tightly organized notation. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Go ahead." "When you were in the Navy, what specifically did you do?" He looked up at her. "Why?" "Because I've been watching you for a week," she said, "and I've been trying to put a category on it, and I can't. The way you built the picture of Salazar's operation from street observation alone, the documentation structure, the way you talked about the facility, that's not infantry. That's not even special operations in the way I've seen it described." She paused. "My cousin was Force Recon Marines. He's smart, he's capable, he's well-trained. He's not this." Evan was quiet for a moment. "Intelligence support to special operations," he said. "Technically, I was a SEAL. Practically, I spent most of the last 6 years on joint task force assignments that were more collection and analysis than direct action. So you built target packages, and sometimes executed on them, in places you can't name, in places nobody names." She absorbed that. "How many operations?" "I stopped counting." "Why?" He looked at his coffee. "Because the number stopped being useful information." She was quiet for a moment. "Is that why they discharged you? The knee?" He didn't answer right away. Outside, a car went past, slow enough that he tracked it automatically. Civilian, wrong direction for a surveillance pattern. Nobody he recognized in the driver's seat. "The knee was the medical basis," he said. "The actual reason was that I raised a concern about an operation, a targeting decision. I thought the intelligence was being interpreted too aggressively for the confidence level of the source." He turned the coffee cup in his hands. "I was right. The operation was executed anyway. 3 civilians died who weren't the target." He paused. "I wasn't discharged for raising the concern. I was discharged because after that, the working relationship was what it was." Sophia looked at him for a long time. "I'm sorry," she said. "Not the reflexive kind. The kind where someone actually means it." "Don't be. I'd rather know I raised it." He looked at the table. "Most days." She nodded slowly. Then she looked at the moleskin pages. "What are you building right now?" "A case package," he said, "that ye can take directly to a federal judge without touching the county chain at all. Documented timeline, financial records, physical surveillance log, the recording you made, the ledger from your father, the accounting anomalies from Dennis Kuo." He organized the pages slightly as he talked. "It's not complete. There are things a proper investigation would develop that I can't get from street level, but it's enough to establish probable cause for the facility. That's the entry point. And if it works, Yi gets a warrant, deploys a tactical team that doesn't run through Grayport PD command, and executes simultaneously against the facility and Salazar's primary residence. Everything moves at once, so there's no window for the leak in Donovan's department to pass a warning. And if someone warns him anyway?" Evan looked at her steadily. "Then the people in those rooms disappear. Salazar's lawyers file a motion within 48 hours challenging everything, and we're back to where Grayport's been for 11 years. She held his gaze. "So it has to work. It has to work." She stood up, collected his empty cup without asking, brought a fresh one back. It was a small action, purely practical, something she'd done 10,000 times in this room. But it felt, in context, like a thing that meant something beyond itself. She sat back down. "There's something you should know," she said. Her voice had changed. Not dramatically. A degree of careful in it that hadn't been there before. "Decker didn't only threaten my father tonight. He said—" She stopped, started again. "He said they've been watching you specifically, not just monitoring, watching." She looked at the table. "He said there's a file on you, on your discharge. He said Salazar has people who know how to use things like that." Evan was quiet. "What does that mean?" she asked. "It means they found someone with access to my discharge documentation and they're building a narrative," he said. "Veteran with a disciplinary background, even implied by, becomes harder to take seriously. Anything I've documented can be challenged as the actions of an unstable individual with a grudge." "Can they actually do that?" "They can try." He picked up the fresh coffee. "Which is why the package I give Yi has to be solid enough that the source doesn't matter. The evidence speaks without me. And the discharge thing? The targeting decision?" He looked at her. "It's accurately documented. I raised a concern through proper channels. It went nowhere. That's the record." He paused. "What Salazar's people will try to spin it as is a different thing. But spin requires an audience willing to believe it. And a federal judge reviewing documented trafficking evidence is not that audience." She seemed to weigh that, accept it. "Okay," she said. She stood up. "I'll let you work." She went back to the kitchen. He heard her moving back there, the small sounds of someone too awake to sleep, doing tasks that didn't need doing because doing them was better than sitting with the weight of what tomorrow held. He looked at the moleskin, picked up the pen. Worked until 3. Agent Karen Yi was not what Evan had pictured, though he'd learned long ago that people rarely were. She was 47, compact, with close-cut hair and the specific quality of attention that developed in people who spent years listening to witnesses describe terrible things and had learned to hear not just what was said, but what was organized around. She met them at a coffee shop in Millhaven, a town 40 minutes north of Grayport that Donovan had chosen specifically because it was outside Salazar's documented territory of influence and had no connection to any business or official Evan had identified. Donovan had brought Evan. She hadn't told anyone in her department where she was going. She'd said she was running a personal errand on her day off, which was the most boring possible cover story and therefore the best. Yi had come alone. Her car, Evan noted, had federal plates, which in a civilian parking lot was not ideal from a low-profile standpoint, but she'd parked it at the far end away from the coffee shop entrance, and that was probably the best available option. They sat in the back corner. Evan put his back to the wall, and Yi, without comment, took the chair that gave her the same position on the opposite axis, which told him something about her. Shadow lay under the table and was completely ignored by Yi, which was also a data point. Not discomfort with the dog, just total focus on the content of the conversation. The dog cataloged and set aside as irrelevant to the matter at hand. Donovan made the introductions briefly. Then she looked at Evan and stepped back, which was the right call. She was handing it. Evan opened the moleskin. He briefed Yi in the same format he'd briefed things for 11 years. Sequential, sourced, confidence level clearly labeled for each element. He didn't editorials. He didn't ask her to feel anything about the information. He laid it in front of her, in order, and let the structure of it do the work. She stopped him twice, both times to ask for source clarification on specific items. Her questions were precise, not skeptical in a defensive way, but in the way of someone who needed to know exactly what level of documentation she was holding before she decided what to build with it. When he finished, she sat with it for a moment. "The facility observation on nights 2 and 3, she said. "The heat signature estimate. You said 4 in the first room, 3 in the second. What's the confidence on that?" "Moderate, low light, no thermal imaging, behavioral indicators only. Could be 3 in the first room, could be 5. The presence is confirmed. The count is an estimate." She nodded, wrote something. "The entry," she said, without looking up. "When you went inside." "Yes." "Tell me exactly what you did and didn't touch." He told her. She listened. "You wore gloves?" "No, I didn't touch surfaces. Entry was through the ventilation access, visual observation only, exit the same way. I can give you the specific route, the observation positions, the door locations of the holding rooms. Did anyone see you? No. How confident? High. The personnel pattern I'd established over 3 days. I moved through the lowest coverage window. Nobody inside the facility was in a position to have seen me from any of the access points. But you can't be 100%. I can never be 100%, he said. 92, 93. She almost smiled at the precision of that. Almost. The recording Sofia Alvarez made, Yi said, turning to Donovan. Evidentiary status? She's a party to the conversation, Donovan said. One-party consent state. It's clean. I want to hear it. Donovan produced her phone. The recording was 47 seconds. Decker's voice was clear. The ambient diner noise actually helped, provided acoustic context that placed the recording unmistakably in a specific real environment. He spoke with the casual certainty of a man who had said things like this many times in places where it didn't result in a recording. Yi listened with her head slightly down, perfectly still. When it finished, she looked up. That's extortion and criminal threatening on the record. Combined with the financial documentation, she tapped the moleskin. And the trafficking indicators at the facility. It's enough for probable cause, Evan said. Probably. She said it carefully. My section chief is going to want more on the facility itself before we commit tactical resources. The financial and extortion package alone. That's a strong case, but trafficking requires facility confirmation. You need inside. I need a second observation at minimum, ideally with equipment. Evan looked at her. I know the entry point. I know the coverage pattern. I can go back in with whatever you give me and document the interior properly. That's not... She stopped, looked at him. You're not federal. If you go back in with equipment I've provided... Then we never discuss how the documentation was gathered. The equipment malfunctioned, you never provided it, and the facility was observed remotely. He kept his voice level. Or you put your own people on it, which takes time you don't have, because Salazar moved last night and he's going to keep moving. The fires were a message. The next thing won't be. Yi looked at Donovan. Donovan looked back with the expression of someone who had already had this internal argument and had arrived reluctantly at Evan's position. This is... Yi pressed her lips together. This is a long way outside protocol. So is burning down a family's hotel with a child inside, Evan said. A silence. Yi picked up her coffee, put it down without drinking. Looked at the table. The documentation needs to be detailed enough to support independent verification, she said carefully. If I'm reviewing material that was gathered during what I'm characterizing as a remote technical observation of a commercial facility from an adjacent property. I understand the characterization, Evans said, and you need to stay clean enough that you're not a liability in testimony. I don't plan to testify about entry methods. I plan to testify about what I observed from documented positions and what the recording states and what the financial records show. Yi looked at him steadily for a long moment. You were intelligence corps, she said. Not a question. SEAL. Intel adjacent for most of my career. You've done source handling? Yes. She nodded slowly, the nod of someone filing things. There's a CI kit in my car. Basic. Thermal sensor, low-lux camera, GPS tracker. She paused. I'm going to leave it in the parking lot. I'm going to walk away. I'm not going to see anything that happens to it. Evan said nothing. The window is tonight, she said. Because I can have a judge on the phone by tomorrow morning if you give me what I need, and I need it before Salazar moves again. She looked at Donovan. The leak in your department. I haven't identified the individual, Donovan said, but I've isolated the information flow. Whatever I filed about, you went through standard case management, which means it had access exposure to, at minimum. Don't tell me names, Yi said sharply. Not yet. Tell me one thing. Does the leak have access to tactical deployment schedules? Donovan hesitated. Potentially, yes. Then when we execute, your department gets notified at H-30, not before. Your commander will deal with it after the fact, Yee's voice was flat and final. I'm not blowing 11 people in a tactical element because someone in Grayport PD is on Salazar's payroll. That's not a conversation I'm having with the families. She picked up her coffee again, this time drank it. Half hour after I leave, there's a black nylon bag in the trunk of my car. The trunk will be unlocked. She stood, straightened her jacket. I don't know either of you, she said. I came up here today to look at a marina. I'm going back to Seattle. She looked at Evan. You have until 4 a.m. After 4 a.m., the observation window closes because the shift pattern changes and the personnel density goes up. She picked up her phone. Don't call me until you have what I need. She left the coffee shop without looking back. Donovan let out a breath she'd been holding for what seemed like a while. Can you do it? She said. I can do it. Your knee. Claire. First time he'd used her name. She blinked slightly. I can do it? She looked at him for a moment. Then she reached into her jacket and put something on the table between them, a small folded paper with a handwritten number on it. My personal cell, not the department line. Anything changes, anything goes wrong. Nothing's going to go wrong. She gave him a look that said she'd heard that before and knew what it was worth. Don't get dead, she said. I'm serious. You're the only person in this situation who doesn't live here, which means you're the only person who's going to be able to leave when this is over. Don't make me file a report about you. He pocketed the number. I'll try not to. She left. He sat in the back corner of the coffee shop for a few minutes, finishing his coffee, letting the operational picture settle into final configuration. Entry point. Route. Coverage timing. Documentation priorities. Shadow put his chin on the table edge and looked at Evan with the expectant patience of an animal that had been through enough of these moments to know what they preceded. Tonight, Evan said. Shadow's tail moved once. What? He went in at 0138. Same entry point, same approach route, but this time with the CI kit slung under his jacket. Thermal sensor, camera, the GPS tracker he wouldn't use tonight, because attaching a tracker to anything inside the facility added a variable that wasn't worth the intelligence gain. The camera and thermal sensor were what mattered. The approach took 19 minutes. He moved slower than last time, partly because of the equipment and partly because his ribs had decided, in the cold night air, to register a formal complaint about the previous night's events at the hotel. He breathed through it, steady and mechanical. The blind corner was exactly as he'd left it. Inside was the same geography, same heat, same low structural roar of industrial ventilation equipment. He moved through the space with the specific economy of someone who has pre-visualized every turn, every doorway, every distance, and is now executing a mental map rather than exploring. The holding rooms were at the facility's back third, past the main warehouse floor and through the internal passage with the keypad. The keypad access itself, he didn't have it, hadn't expected to, didn't need it. What he needed was on the near side of the door. He set up the thermal sensor at the angle he'd pre-calculated, which gave him a readout through the construction-grade partition wall without requiring entry. Modern thermal doesn't need direct line of sight through glass. It reads heat differential through standard drywall at short range. The partition was drywall over steel stud, probably installed during a retrofit, which meant it was exactly thin enough. 7 individuals. 2 rooms. He documented the readouts with the camera, got 3 clean images of each room showing the thermal signatures in unmistakable human configuration. Sleeping forms, resting postures, the specific thermal profile of human bodies in confined space. Not equipment, not animals. People. He also documented the door hardware. The cable lock anchors were visible from the near side of the passage. Their chain configuration photographable through the passage gap without full entry. He got 4 images. Clear. On his way back out, moving through the main warehouse floor, he paused at the loading dock manifest board. Paper system, handwritten, updated with marker. He photographed the current manifest, then the one beneath it, which was curling at the corner, then the scheduling board beside it, which showed the next 4 inbound runs and their estimated vehicle configurations. 3 vehicles, night after tomorrow. He noted the date. He went back out the way he came. The ventilation access pulled shut behind him with the same resistance it had offered on entry. He was in the alley before he let himself take a full breath. His knee had gone past complaint into the specific grinding numbness that meant he'd been on it too long in the cold. He walked it out on the way back, keeping the pace even, not limping any more than he could help, because limping at 2 a.m. in a harbor district drew a specific kind of attention from anyone who was watching. He was at the motel by 3:15. He called Yi at 3:18. She answered in 2 rings. He said, "I have 7 confirmed. 2 holding rooms. Cable restraints documented. Manifest data for the next inbound. 3 vehicles, night after tomorrow." A silence. "Send everything to the secure address I texted you," she said. Her voice was very controlled and very focused. "All of it. Tonight. Already uploading." 7, she said quietly. Just the word to herself, like she was setting it down somewhere. "At minimum," Evan said. Another silence. "I'll have a judge by 9 a.m., she said. "We execute before the next inbound, which gives us 36 hours. Yes." A pause. "Get some sleep." "Working on it." He put the phone down, looked at the ceiling. Shadow was already asleep on the floor, his breathing slow and even, his paws occasionally twitching with whatever dogs chased in their sleep. Evan pressed his palm against his knee and held it there until the grinding sensation downgraded to a dull pulse. 36 hours. He was almost asleep when his phone lit up with a text from a number he didn't recognize. 3 words. "We have Sophia." He stared at it. Then a second message arrived from the same number 4 seconds later. "Come alone. Leave the dog. Pier 7, 1 hour, or she doesn't come back." The room was very quiet. Evan sat up, put his feet on the floor, and reached for his jacket. He didn't leave Shadow behind. That was the first decision, made in approximately 4 seconds while he was still reading the second message. Leave the dog was not an instruction he was going to follow, for reasons both tactical and personal, and anyone who knew anything real about how trained protection dogs operated would have known that separating the handler from the animal was a request designed to reduce capability, not a logistical preference, which meant whoever sent the message understood, at least partially, what Shadow was, which meant they were afraid of him. Good. He texted Donovan first, 3 words, Pier 7, now. Then the screenshots of both messages. He didn't wait for her reply. He texted Yi the same thing, added, "Timeline moved. They have a hostage. Do not wait for daylight." Then he put the phone in his jacket pocket, clipped Shadow's lead, not the civilian walk lead, the short tactical one from the duffel, the one Shadow recognized by feel and responded to differently than the others, and went out the door into the dark. He had 53 minutes. He used the first 8, moving to a position 2 blocks north of Pier 7, where he could observe the facility's exterior approach without being observed himself. The harbor at 4 a.m. was not empty. Harbors never were, not entirely. But the activity that existed was concentrated toward the working pier's far end, fishing vessels prepping for early runs, a lights-on chandlery with someone moving inside. Nobody near Salazar's facility. 2 vehicles in the parking area he hadn't seen before. A panel van he recognized from the facility's regular rotation, and a dark sedan that was new, parked at the main entrance in a way that blocked it partially. Not security positioning, blocking positioning. They wanted the front visible. They wanted him walking toward the front, which meant the front was the wrong approach. He spent 4 minutes observing and confirming. Shadow was completely still beside him, the short lead loose between them, his entire body in the particular configuration that Evan had seen exactly twice before in active operations. Total engagement, every system running, none of it leaking into sound or movement. Evan pressed his hand briefly against the dog's side. Shadow's heart rate was elevated but controlled. Good. He went around the south perimeter. The ventilation access was on the facility's east face. He'd used it twice. They might know about it. If they'd done a security review after his first entry, they might have found the disturbance at the seal. But he was betting they hadn't. Salazar's people were watchers and intimidators, not operators. The difference between someone who controlled territory through fear and someone who defended territory through training was specific and significant, and Evan had spent his career on the side of the distinction that mattered tonight. The access opened the same way it had both times before. Inside. He unclipped Shadow's lead and gave the hand signal. Flat palm, fingers spread, then 2 fingers pointing forward. Shadow's working signal. The dog moved into the space ahead of Evan with a silence that still, even after 9 years, produced in Evan a specific kind of awe. Not the performative awe of someone watching a trick. The awe of someone who understood exactly how much work and trust and shared history produced that movement. The main warehouse floor was lit differently than his previous entries. Overhead fluorescents were on in the rear section, toward the internal passage, toward the holding rooms. Someone had turned them on recently. The light spilled in a rectangle across the concrete floor, clean-edged, and it meant people were back there, awake and waiting. He stopped. Listened. Voices. 2, possibly 3. The specific cadence of people positioned and waiting rather than in motion. He assessed the geometry. The lit section was the trap. Walk into the light, become visible, lose the initiative. The trap required him to approach from the expected direction, from the passage entrance, presenting himself as instructed. Walking into it voluntarily while they held Sophia was the calculation they were counting on. He moved along the north wall instead, staying outside the light spill, using the shadow margin where the overhead fixtures didn't reach. Shadow tracked with him, matching his pace without signal, reading his movement the way the dog had learned to read it over years of working at close range. He got to an angle where he could see into the lit section through a gap in the warehouse shelving without entering it. Sophia was on a metal chair, hands zip-tied in front of her, not behind, which meant someone had wanted her to be visibly restrained but not in immediate pain, which meant she was a display more than a prisoner. Still, her jaw was set in the specific way Evan had come to associate with her processing fear by converting it into something she could use. She was alert, not hurt, looking toward the passage entrance, the direction they expected Evan to come from. 3 men. Decker, his arm in a professional wrap from the dog bite, standing 6 feet from Sophia with the specific posture of someone who had been tasked to remain in position and was finding it tedious. 2 others, one near the passage entrance, one positioned along the far wall. And Salazar. He stood near the back, slightly removed from the others, in the same careful clothes he'd worn in the Escalade, with the same engineered neutrality on his face. He was looking at his phone. The casualness of it, standing in his own facility where people were being held in the back rooms, waiting for a man he intended to end, was the most genuinely chilling thing Evan had seen in the entire situation, and he'd seen things in the past week that cleared a high bar. Evan assessed the positions. Decker and the man by the far wall were the immediate threats. Armed, Decker visibly, the other probably. The man at the passage entrance was the cutoff. Salazar was the objective, not in the combat sense, but in the sense that the outcome of tonight was shaped entirely by what happened to him. He had no weapon. He'd established that to Harlan, honestly. The math changed when you were carrying. The math changed in ways he wasn't ready to live with yet. That calculus had not changed tonight. He was not going to shoot his way through this room. He was going to use what he had. He put his hand on Shadow's head, found the position behind the ear, pressed once lightly. The specific contact that wasn't a command, just acknowledgement, that they'd always used before something real. Shadow pressed back. Evan stepped into the light. "You're late," Decker said. Evan kept walking, stopped 8 feet from Sophia, which put her on his left and Decker on his right, and the man by the far wall at his 2 o'clock. The passage entrance man was behind him now. He'd walked past him to get here, and he'd clocked the man's position and the fact that his hands were in his jacket pockets. Shadow had not followed him into the light. Shadow was somewhere in the dark behind the shelving, and every person in this room would spend the next several minutes not knowing where. "You brought the dog," Decker said. "Did I?" Evan looked at him. "He ran off in the parking lot. Hates the smell of fish." Decker's eyes moved to the shadows. Came back. His arm was bothering him. Evan could see the tension around the shoulder where the bite had hit the forearm. The compensatory stiffness of someone managing pain while trying not to show it. Salazar put his phone away, walked forward into the fuller light. "Mr. Mercer," he said, the same careful pleasantness. "I appreciate you coming. You kidnapped someone. I invited you to a conversation under circumstances that would ensure your attendance." He gestured at Sophia briefly, dismissively. She was a prop, and he was acknowledging that without embarrassment. "She's unharmed." "Zip ties on a medical student," Evan said. "Unharmed is a low bar." This could have been avoided. Salazar clasped his hands in front of him, the posture of a man accustomed to the head of a table. "You've been in my city for 12 days. You've disrupted established arrangements. You've spent time with a federal agent. I went to Millhaven to look at the marina. And you've been inside this facility twice." The pleasantness didn't waver. "I want to know what you gave them, and I want you to understand the consequences of what you've already set in motion." Evan looked at him. "Cut her loose," he said. "When we've reached an understanding." "Cut her loose," Evan said again. Same tone, same pace. "Or this conversation doesn't go the way you planned it." Salazar tilted his head slightly. "Mr. Mercer, there are 4 men in this room. I'm told your particular capabilities are somewhat overstated outside their original context, and your—" He paused, calibrating. "Your medical history suggests a level of physical limitation that—" "Victor," Evan said the name the way you'd stop a car. "You ran a search on my discharge file, which means you found the summary document, which is a 1-page administrative record." He took one step forward. "You didn't find the operational file, because the operational file is classified at a level your contact in the city records department doesn't have access to, and the parts that aren't classified have been running under a different name for reasons I'm not going to explain to you here." Another step. "What I'm going to tell you is that I've spent 11 years doing exactly what I've been doing in your city for the last 12 days, in locations where the people I was assessing had actual resources and actual training and actual intelligence support, and I did it without being caught. In your city, with your people, I did it while eating breakfast at a family diner and walking my dog." Salazar was very still. "So when I tell you to cut her loose," Evan said, "I want you to consider the possibility that I'm telling you that because I'm giving you a window to make this slightly less bad for yourself, and not because I think you currently have the leverage you believe you have." A silence. Then from the shadows, not a growl, not a bark, just movement. Just the sound of something large and trained relocating through a dark space and then going quiet again. Somewhere else now. The man by the far wall turned his head toward the sound. Decker's eyes moved left, then right, then back to center, and something had changed in his face. The same recalibration Evan had seen at the diner, the moment when the contempt starts doing the math and finding it doesn't add up. "He's moving," the man at the passage entrance said behind Evan, quietly, to Decker. "I know he's moving," Decker said. He didn't sound confident about what that meant. Salazar looked at Evan for a long moment. The engineered neutrality was intact, but something underneath it had shifted. A very small tightening around the eyes, the micro-expression of a man who had planned a conversation and was now aware the conversation had departed from the plan. "You said 12 days, Salazar said. 12 days. And in 12 days you believe you have enough—" "The warrant application was filed at 9:17 this morning," Evan said. "Federal. It went to Judge Carla Messin in the Western District. She was approving it as of 40 minutes ago." He watched Salazar's face. "The tactical team doesn't run through Grayport PD. They mobilize from Seattle. They don't need your security firm's access codes or your contact in the department chain. They execute simultaneously against this facility and your primary residence on Whitmore Drive. Right now they're staged 22 miles north, and they're waiting for one phone call." Salazar said nothing. "The holding rooms," Evan said quietly. 7 people. I documented them twice. The second documentation is better." He held Salazar's gaze. "Federal trafficking charges don't negotiate well. Your lawyers know that, which is why they've kept you away from anything with a trafficking signature for 11 years. He paused. "That ends tonight." Salazar looked at him for a long time. Something was happening behind that careful face. Evan couldn't see all of it, but he could see the edges of it, and the edges looked like a man who had run the calculation several times and was arriving at the same answer each time, and didn't like the answer. "Cut her loose," Salazar said quietly. He said it to Decker, not to Evan. Decker stared at him. "Victor, do it." Flat, final. Decker produced a knife, folded, small, the kind of thing a careful man carried as a utility rather than a weapon. He cut Sophia's zip ties in 2 quick movements. She stood immediately, pulled away from the chair, moved to Evan's side without being directed to, which was exactly the right call. "You okay?" Evan said without looking at her. "Yes," she said. One word, clipped, controlled. "Stay left." She moved left. Salazar had not moved. He was looking at Evan with an expression that had arrived at something new. Not rage, not despair. Something more composed than either, and more dangerous in its composure. Because composed men who have lost made decisions that cornered men didn't. "You understand what you've done," Salazar said. "Not just tonight. The arrangements in this city. The infrastructure. The employment. The contracts. The extortion and the trafficking," Evan said. "The stability," Salazar said. "You've decided one man's moral framework should override a system that functions." 7 people in 2 rooms disagreed with your definition of function," Evan said. "I'll take their vote over yours." A long silence. Then Salazar did something Evan hadn't expected. He nodded. Not an agreement, a different kind of nod. The acknowledgement of a man who recognizes that a thing is finished. "Make the call," Salazar said. To Evan. Evan took out his phone, called Yi. She answered before the first ring completed. "Execute," he said. What followed was not clean. It never was. The movies always made tactical entries look like choreography. Precise, timed, surgically efficient. The reality was that 11 federal agents coming through 2 separate entry points simultaneously produced a controlled chaos that was professional and effective, and still, in the moment of it, loud and disorienting and full of shouted commands, and the specific cacophony of people reacting to overwhelming force with a range of responses from immediate compliance to a panicked sprint toward the facility's secondary exit that ended 30 feet later when the 2 agents already positioned there stepped out. Decker ran. That was not a surprise. He made it 20 feet before Shadow hit him from the left side. Not a bite, a body hit. 95 pounds of dog at full extension catching Decker mid-stride and dropping him to the concrete in a controlled takedown that left Decker on his stomach and Shadow standing on his back with all the professional satisfaction of an animal completing a task he was specifically trained for. Shadow, bleb. Stay. Shadow stayed. Decker did not move. Evan put his hands up the moment the agents entered, clearly and deliberately, because he was standing in the middle of a federal raid, and the last thing anyone needed was ambiguity. Beside him, Sophia did the same, reading the room the same way she'd read every room since the diner, quickly, correctly, without wasting time on emotions she'd process later. They were separated immediately, taken to the facility's edge, identified, and held in the professional holding pattern of agents managing multiple elements simultaneously. Evan gave his name, his ID, his discharge documents. The agent who processed him was young, mid-20s, the specific intensity of someone on their first real raid. And he looked at Evan with the barely concealed curiosity of someone who had been briefed on what this civilian had provided and was trying to reconcile the briefing with the actual person. "You're Mercer," he said. "Yes." "You—" He stopped, looked at the moleskin that another agent had bagged. "You built this whole thing from foot surveillance?" "And a ledger," Evan said. "The ledger's important." The agent nodded, the nod of someone storing information for later processing. He moved on. Yi arrived through the main entrance 12 minutes after the entry team. She moved through the facility with the efficient attention of someone who had done this part before, speaking briefly to her lead agent, receiving updates with nods and quiet redirections, making decisions quickly and without second-guessing. When she reached the internal passage and the 2 holding rooms, she stopped. Evan couldn't hear what she said to the agent beside her. He watched her face from across the warehouse floor. What he saw there made him look away. 7 people. 4 from the first room, 3 from the second. They came through the passage door slowly, with the specific movement of people who had been in a confined space for an unknown period and were not yet certain that what was happening was better than what they were leaving. 3 women, 2 men, a teenage boy, a girl who looked younger than that. A federal victim specialist was already there. Yi had brought one, which meant she'd planned for exactly this, which meant she was thorough in the way that mattered. Evan watched from the edge of the activity. Sophia was beside him. Someone had given her a jacket. A federal agent's spare, too large, worn over her shoulders. She was watching the same thing Evan was watching with an expression that was not shock, exactly because she'd known cognitively what the rooms contained. It was the difference between knowing a thing and seeing it, and the scene was doing something to her face that was honest and uncontrolled in a way her usual careful composure wasn't. "The girl from the second room," she said quietly. Evan looked. The younger girl, 11, maybe 12, was sitting on a crate near the victim specialist, wrapped in a thermal blanket, looking at her own hands with the unfocused attention of someone whose brain was still processing whether the current situation was real. "I see her," Evan said. Sophia was quiet for a moment. Then, "I'm going to specialize in trauma. When I finish my degree." She said it like a decision she'd been approaching for a long time and had just arrived at, right here in this room. Pediatric trauma, specifically. Evan didn't say anything. Some things didn't need a response. Salazar was arrested at 3:58 in the morning. He gave no resistance, made no statements, and requested his attorney with the calm efficiency of a man who had rehearsed this exact scenario and was executing the rehearsed response without deviation. Philip Crane arrived at the Federal Processing Center 6 hours later and spent 45 minutes in a conference room before emerging with an expression that told a clear story about the quality of the evidence he'd just reviewed: the financial records, the payment ledger, the observation documentation, Sophia's recording, the holding room documentation, the manifests, Dennis Kuo's accounting anomalies, which cross-referenced against Salazar's corporate filings in a way that suggested a decade of financial structuring that the federal forensic accounting team would spend the next 4 months untangling. And 7 survivors who, once removed from the facility and provided medical care and legal protection, began to speak. The first statement came from a woman named Elena, 31, who had been at the facility for 22 days. She spoke to the victim specialist for 4 hours. Then she asked to write down the names of 3 other people she knew of who had passed through the facility and been moved to a different location. She wrote the names in careful capital letters and handed the paper to the specialist, and then sat with her hands in her lap for a moment, very still, as if she'd been carrying the weight of those names and was figuring out what her hands felt like without it. Those 3 names led, over the following weeks, to a trafficking network that extended across 4 counties and 2 states, and had been using Salazar's logistics infrastructure as its primary transport mechanism for at least 3 years. Decker was arrested at the facility, with Shadow's paw print still on the back of his jacket. He pled out 6 weeks later, provided testimony in exchange for a reduced sentence, and his testimony, combined with the financial documentation, closed the case on Salazar's 11 years in Grayport in a way that no lawyer, however skilled, could disassemble. The compromised officer in Donovan's department was identified through the information flow analysis she'd been running. He was a sergeant named Holloway, who had been on Salazar's payroll for 4 years. He arrested, resigned before the formal charge was filed, and pled guilty in a proceeding that was, professionally, one of the ugliest things Donovan had seen in her career, and personally one of the most necessary. She told Evan about it over coffee at the diner 3 weeks after the raid. 4 years, she said. He was at my daughter's birthday party 2 years ago. People are complex, Evan said. It was inadequate and he knew it. They are. She looked at her coffee. I keep thinking about Reyes. Whether if Holloway wasn't in the department, Reyes's report gets processed correctly. Whether the investigation starts a year earlier. She paused. Whether Reyes is still alive. Evan didn't have an answer for that. Nobody did. He knew what he was doing, she said, about Holloway. He knew exactly what he was enabling, the fires, the families, the people in those rooms. Her voice was very level. Complexity doesn't cover that. No, Evan agreed, it doesn't. She looked at him. What are you going to do now? It was the first time anyone had asked him that, the forward version, what comes next, rather than the backward version of what he'd come from. He'd been in Greyport for 7 weeks now. The cheap motel had upgraded to a weekly rental at a small apartment above the bait shop on Harbor Street, partly because it was cheaper by the day, and partly because he'd stopped thinking about leaving the same way he'd been thinking about it when he arrived. I've been talking to Dennis Kuo, he said, and Miguel, and a couple of the other business owners. She waited. The community infrastructure here, he said, the thing that Salazar exploited, it's fragile, not because the people are weak, but because they've been isolated from each other deliberately. Fear does that. Keeps people from organizing, from building shared visibility, from knowing enough about their neighbors to recognize when something's wrong. He turned his cup in his hands. That's a solvable problem. Not with a gun. With information, connection, legal knowledge, economic support. He paused. Harlan wants to restart the neighborhood watch. Rosa Mendez wants to set up a community legal fund. Dennis can provide financial literacy support to businesses that are recovering. Sophia, Donovan said, and she almost smiled. Sophia wants to be involved before she goes back to school. She has 8 weeks. Donovan looked at him for a long moment. You're going to build something. Something small, he said. See if it holds. Most veterans I know who come back from what you came back from, she said carefully, don't usually choose this. Choose what? Staying. In a place where it's still messy and unfinished and nothing is resolved as neatly as you'd want. She paused. It's easier to move on. Next town, next situation. Evan looked out the window at Harbor Street. The morning light on the water was the specific silver gray of the Pacific coast in early spring. Not warm exactly, but clear. The bait shop was open. A man he recognized from the neighborhood was walking past with a coffee from Tuan's cart. Normal, unheroic, unremarkable morning in a harbor town. I know, he said. I tried that for 7 weeks. The Guardian Harbor Initiative launched quietly, 6 weeks later, from a converted storage room behind Miguel's restaurant that Miguel donated without being asked. No announcement, no press release. A handwritten sign on the door, a folding table, 4 chairs, and a whiteboard that Dennis Kuo had brought from his office. The first meeting had 11 people. By the third meeting, it had 31. By the end of the first month, it had representatives from every business on Clement Avenue and a waiting list from 2 adjacent streets. Evan ran the operational side, threat recognition training, documentation protocols, how to preserve evidence, how to recognize patterns of organized intimidation before they became entrenched. Donovan came twice to speak about legal resources and official reporting channels, speaking with the candor of someone who had made peace with the system's limitations and was helping people navigate around them rather than pretending they didn't exist. Dennis managed the financial recovery support. Harlan ran the neighborhood watch coordination with the specific motivated energy of a man who had been angry for a long time and had finally found productive work for it. Sophia ran the victim support component for 8 weeks. She organized the connection between the 7 survivors from Pier 7 and the Federal Victim Services infrastructure, drove 2 of them to appointments herself when transportation was an issue, stayed on the phone with Elena twice during particularly bad nights, and managed all of it while also studying for her year-end examinations in the hours between. On the last night before she went back to school, she came to booth 9, sat across from Evan, and said, I'm coming back in the summer. I know, he said. You could have left, she said, after the raid. There was nothing keeping you here. Shadow likes the fish smell, he said. She looked at Shadow, who was under the table with his head on his paws, radiating contentment. He really doesn't seem to, she said. He's adapting. She smiled. A real one. Not the careful, controlled version she'd worn for most of the past 2 months. Then she stood, picked up her bag, put it on her shoulder. Thank you, she said. Simple. Direct. Your recording broke the case, he said. I want you to know that. She nodded once, accepting it, not deflecting. Then she walked out. He watched her go through the window. She stopped to say something to Miguel at the counter, hugged him in the specific way of someone who means it and knows they mean it, and then walked out into the gray port morning. Miguel came over with 2 coffees, set one in front of Evan, sat down. They were quiet for a while in the way that people are quiet when they don't need to fill the silence. "The sign in the window," Miguel said finally. "You see it?" Evan looked. In the lower corner of the diner's front window, a small printed card had appeared sometime in the last few days. White background, simple text. "This business is a member of Guardian Harbor." "When did you put that up?" "I didn't." Miguel looked at his coffee. "Harlan did. Then Rosa. Then the Suwanakeets." A pause. "Then 7 others." He paused again. By Thursday, there were 14. Evan looked at the sign. It was a small piece of paper in a diner window. Nothing dramatic about it. Nobody was taking photographs of it. It wasn't on the news. But it meant that 14 businesses on Clement Avenue and Harbor Street had decided, collectively, that the correct response to what had happened was not to go quiet and hope it didn't happen again. It meant that 14 separate human beings, each carrying their own version of the past 2 months, had decided that visibility was better than invisibility and that together was better than alone. 14 signs in 14 windows. Evan wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. Shadow made a sound under the table. Not quite a sigh, something softer than that. The particular sound of a dog settling in. The morning light came through the diner's windows the same way it always had, catching the dust motes and the coffee steam and the hand-painted letters on the glass, falling across Miguel's grandfather's booths in long, pale lines. Regular, ordinary morning. The harbor outside was gray and real and unheroic and entirely, straightforwardly exactly what it was. Evan drank his coffee. He'd driven into Grayport 7 weeks ago looking for somewhere to disappear. He'd found, instead, the specific and difficult and deeply human work of refusing to, and discovered, in the refusing, that the wound that 11 years of war had opened and 7 weeks of driving had not closed had been reached, finally, not by silence or distance, but by the opposite of both. Shadow's tail moved once under the table. Evan put his hand down and felt the familiar warmth of the dog's head against his palm. Outside, Harbor Street was waking up. The signs were in the windows, and somewhere, a 14-year-old girl who had come through a burning building was eating breakfast with her mother without checking the door. What? Courage is not the absence of fear. It is the decision that something else, someone else, matters more. And when one person makes that decision out loud, in the open, where others can see it, the ones who were afraid to go first discover they were never actually alone.